They say a house doesn't fall down because of a massive earthquake, but because of a single measurement that was off by a fraction of an inch. Right from the beginning, I found my missing inch on a Sunday morning tucked inside a bathroom trash can. And just like that, the whole structure of my life started to lean in a way I couldn't fix. Linda had been gone for 12 days down in Cabo San Lucas with 4 of her girlfriends who collectively dropped more cash on expensive sunscreen than most folks pay for a month's rent. She came home with a golden tan, a bag full of overpriced hot sauce she would probably never even open, and a little something extra. She forgot to mention at customs. I had no idea what that secret was at the time. I was just honestly happy to have her back, and that is the part that still stings when I think about it because I was genuinely glad to see her. I drove out to Salt Lake City International on a Friday night to pick her up, and I stood there at the arrivals gate with my hands shoved in my jacket pockets, feeling like some guy in a romantic movie when she finally walked through those double doors. She was glowing from the sun, laughing at something on her phone and dragging a suitcase with a busted wheel that she definitely broke herself but would never admit to. In a million years, I felt that specific kind of relief a man gets when he has been surviving on bowls of cereal for nearly 2 weeks and is just thrilled to see his wife again. I told her she looked great, and she told me she felt incredible. Then she gave me a quick kiss, the kind you give to a comfortable old roommate instead of a husband you actually missed. I noticed it right away, because being an architect means you are trained to spot the tiny flaws in the design, but I just pushed it to the back of my mind for the moment. The ride back up to Emigration Canyon was perfectly normal as she went on and on about Maya's sunburn and the infinity pool at the resort and some story about a boat trip on the 4th day where someone had too many margaritas and tumbled off the stern. She was laughing, and I was laughing right along with her as the road wound up toward the house in that soft October twilight, and everything looked exactly like a life that was working out just fine. I had no clue. I was driving through the last normal hour I would have for a very long time. The house we lived in was my own design, and I don't mean that as a brag. It was just a fact. 1,200 square feet of simple lines built right into the hillside, like it was part of the earth made of glass and reclaimed wood, with views that made the mountains feel like they were sitting in the living room with you. I built it the way I handle everything in life, starting with a solid foundation and intending for it to last long. After I was gone, Linda had always pushed for something flashier, something over in Federal Heights or the East Bench where her friends lived with their 6 bedrooms and wine cellars and houses that shouted at you. Before you even pulled into the driveway, I told her no as gently as I could until I had to be firm, and she eventually gave in the way she always does when she realizes an argument with me is only going to go one way. She had big social goals because she had worked her tail off to get where she was, and she wanted the world to see it. I didn't hold that against her. I loved her for it. Even if I didn't feel the same way, we had 10 years of marriage under our belts. 10 years of her laugh and her truly awful taste in reality TV and her habit of rearranging the kitchen cabinets every few months because she decided the coffee mugs were in the wrong spot. You don't just toss 10 years away because the numbers get a little messy, but you definitely have to look at the math. Sunday was the day everything changed. It was the 3rd day she was back, and she was out at brunch with Maya at some trendy spot in Sugar House, which was a weekend tradition that had survived longer than most of my career. I was home doing the laundry, which is basically the invisible backbone of any marriage, and I want to be very clear that I wasn't snooping. I was just emptying the small trash can under the bathroom sink, the one Linda never touches, and there it was wrapped up tight in some tissue paper like someone trying to hide a secret in plain sight. I unwrapped it slowly, the same way I would open up a load-bearing wall during a renovation, knowing that what I found inside might bring the whole roof down on my head 2 lines. I stood there in my bathroom on a quiet Sunday morning in October staring at a positive pregnancy test that belonged to my wife, and then I started doing the math in my head, and the math was not my friend Linda, and I hadn't been together for 3 weeks before she left for Mexico. It wasn't some big fight or anything, just the usual distance that creeps in when you are both busy and tired and living parallel lives in the same house 3 weeks before the trip, plus 12 days in Cabo plus. 3 days back home, I am an architect and I deal in precise measurements, and there was simply no version of these numbers that added up in my favor. I didn't scream or throw anything or collapse on the floor like they do in the movies. I just pulled out my phone and took photos of that test from 3 different angles, making sure to capture the result window, the brand name, and even the date on the box. She hadn't bothered to throw away. Then I wrapped it back up in the tissue, put it exactly where I found it, and went back to finishing the laundry. I called my brother Troy that afternoon while I was out on the Bonneville Shoreline Trail about 2 miles up, where the city starts to look small and the Great Salt Lake looks like a flat sheet of silver in the distance. Troy picked up on the second ring and asked why I was out hiking on a Sunday since I never do that. But he could hear something in my voice before I even said a word. That is the thing about brothers. They can hear the truth underneath. The words I told him the whole story start to finish the trip, the test, and the impossible math. I laid it out like I was explaining a structural failure to a client without getting emotional, because panicking never fixed a leaking roof. When I was done, Troy stayed quiet for a long beat, and then he asked if I was sure, and I told him I am an architect, Troy. I don't guess when it comes to the foundation. I measure things for a living. Okay. A breath. Okay. Do you know who? I have a suspicion, I said. I'm not ready to say it out loud yet. Why not? And once it becomes a thing I know, I have to decide what to do about it. And I'm not ready to decide what to do about it until I know everything. A long pause from Sugar House. You're the only person I know, Troy said slowly, who approaches a marriage crisis like a building permit. Building permits, I said, keep structures from collapsing on people. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I, really. But it sounded right. And sometimes sounding right is the only scaffolding you've got. The suspicion had a name, Brandon Pierce. I'd met Brandon Pierce at a dinner party in Federal Heights 3 years ago. He was the kind of man who filled a room by volume, loud laugh, louder opinions, the specific energy of someone who had made money fast and wanted everyone to feel the heat of it. He ran Hollis Hospitality Group with a partner who did most of the actual work, and he had the handshake of a man who had taken a course on handshakes. His wife, Maya, was sharp and funny and entirely too good for him, which I thought privately and never said out loud, because that is not a thing you say out loud at dinner parties. He and Linda had always been friendly, the easy friendliness of people in the same social orbit who run into each other at the same restaurants and the same rooftop events and the same Maya-organized occasions. I had not thought anything of it. I was an idiot. No, that's not fair to me. I was trusting. There's a difference. Idiots don't notice things. I noticed plenty. I just chose to interpret them generously the way you do when you love someone, and the alternative interpretation is a load-bearing wall you're not ready to knock down. The wall was coming down regardless. I just hadn't swung the hammer yet. I called Dr. Elise Warren on Monday morning from my office at Camper & Briggs on 200 South. She was an OB colleague of a friend, recommended by a physician I'd designed a clinic for in Sugar House 2 years back. I explained the situation with the clinical detachment of a man who had decided that feelings were a second draft problem. I need to understand the confirmation timeline, I said, without involving my wife directly. She was quiet for a moment. Professional, thoughtful. What I can tell you, she said carefully, is that a standard test reads accurate from about 10 to 14 days post-conception. If the test was taken within the first few days of return from a 12-day trip, the conception window would be during the trip, I said. Almost certainly, she said. I'm sorry, Mr. Camper. Don't be, I said. I'm still in the information-gathering phase. Another pause. That's a very architectural way to handle this, she said. So I've been told. Hung up. Sat in my office for exactly 4 minutes looking at the Wasatch Range through my window. Then I called Judith Harper. Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. Judith Harper had been practicing family law in Salt Lake City for 31 years. She was 62, iron-haired, and had the energy of a woman who had seen every variety of human catastrophe and found most of them vaguely predictable. Her office on West Temple had exactly 0 inspirational quotes on the walls, which was the first thing I'd noticed when I'd referred a friend to her years ago, and the reason I'd trusted her ever since. "Ethan Caldwell," she said when she picked up. "Please tell me this is a referral and not a personal Ethaner." "Judith," I said, "I need to talk." A pause. "How bad?" "Possibly architectural." "I'm going to need you to explain what that means." "It means I haven't decided what to demolish yet, but I'm drawing up the plans." She sighed, not impatiently, but the way experienced people sigh when they recognize that a client is going to require their full attention and probably several billable hours. "Come in Thursday," she said, 8 a.m. "Bring everything you have. I'll bring coffee, too." "Ethan Hugh." Her voice softened exactly 1 degree, which for Judith Harper was essentially a hug. "I'm sorry." "Thursday," I said, 8 a.m. I didn't know it yet, but Thursday's meeting with Judith was going to change the shape of everything that came after. Not because of what she told me, because of what she asked. I put down the phone, opened my project files, and went back to work. Because someone has to design the buildings, and because some foundations, once you've seen the crack, you cannot unsee. There is a specific kind of person who can walk through a house that's about to be demolished and still see what it was supposed to be. Most people just see the damage, the cracks, the water stains, the places where the structure gave way. Architects see the original intention underneath all of it, the thing the builder meant before weather and time and bad decisions got involved. I spent 13 days being that kind of person about my own marriage. It was exhausting. I don't recommend it. Day 4, Monday. Linda made breakfast and talked about Maya's plan to redo their kitchen in Federal Heights. Quartz countertops, an island, the whole production. She talked about it the way she talked about most things in those days, slightly too cheerfully with the specific brightness of someone lighting a room to cover a smell. "Maya is beyond excited about it," she told me while she was sliding some eggs onto my plate. "Brandon managed to find a contractor who is supposed to be the best in the state, and I just told her good for Brandon." She caught my eye for a split second before she looked back at the frying pan. She knew I didn't care for Brandon, even if I never came out and said it directly, and Linda had always been real sharp at picking up on the things I left unsaid, which made what she did down in Mexico feel either more calculated or a whole lot worse. I hadn't quite figured out which one it was, yet she told me I should eat up before the food got cold, so I sat there and finished my breakfast while she poured my coffee. We were just 2 people putting on a performance of a marriage for an audience of absolutely nobody. But we were both getting pretty good at the act. The things I was keeping to myself at that table could have filled up a skyscraper. Marcus Dalton has been my business partner for 8 years and my buddy for 12, and he is pretty much the opposite of me in every way that counts. He is loud, where I am quiet, and he goes with his gut. While I stick to the blueprints, he is the kind of guy who closes a deal over a bottle of bourbon and some charm, while I get things done with drawings and documentation. We work well together because of that contrast, and I think good architecture usually works the same way. I finally told him what was going on day 5. It was a Tuesday after our receptionist Janet had headed home for the evening, and the office on 200 South had gone quiet. The way city buildings do after 6 o'clock, where every little sound echoes in the hallway. I laid out the whole situation for him, the pregnancy test, the timing, the trip to Cabo, and Brandon Pierce. Marcus just sat there across from me and didn't say a word for about 90 seconds, which was probably a world record for him. "Brandon Pierce," he finally said, like he was trying to wrap his head around it. "That is my read." I told him Brandon Pierce, who has been trying to get us to put our money into his River District hotel for the last 8 months. Marcus leaned back in his chair, real slow in that way a man does when he is rearranging all the furniture in his mind, and he asked if I was thinking what he was thinking. I told him I had been stuck on that thought since Sunday morning. The investment. Marcus started spinning his pen between his fingers, which is a habit he has had since we were in graduate school together. He mentioned that we hadn't signed a single thing yet, and the term sheet was still just sitting there on his desk. So I told him it would be irresponsible of us not to take our time with some real, thorough due diligence, and he asked how long I needed. I told him I needed 13 days. He just nodded and put the pen down and said he was going to be in a very long meeting. Indefinitely, I didn't realize it then, but those 13 days were going to be the most productive stretch of my professional life, not because of the work I was doing, but because of the work I decided to stop doing. Meeting with Judith Harper on Thursday morning was exactly what I needed, because she is the kind of woman who can look at the blueprint of a disaster and tell you where every single wall is. Without flinching, she told me straight up that I didn't have any proof of paternity yet since a test only proves pregnancy, but the timeline definitely backed up what I was thinking. She reminded me it was all circumstantial, but I told her I wasn't looking to go to court. I was looking to have a conversation. She looked at me over the top of her glasses and asked me to explain myself. So I told her all about Brandon's hotel deal and the investment group and that unsigned paper sitting on Marcus' desk. I told her how the man had spent 7 months trying to convince us to put our capital into his project, and Judith put her pen down and said, "So he spent all that time courting your money while he was also courting your wife." I told her the man clearly liked to multitask, and she almost cracked a smile, which was basically a standing ovation coming from her. She asked me what I wanted the end result to look like, and I told her I wanted a controlled demolition. I wanted the whole structure to come down exactly as it was built on a rotten foundation, and I wanted to make sure nobody got buried in the rubble who didn't deserve to be there. I wanted Brandon Pierce to understand exactly what kind of room he was standing in when he made his choice. She watched me for a long time and then asked about Linda. I looked out the window at the buses moving through the intersection on West Temple and told her that Linda made her choice and I was going to make sure she could live with the fallout without being completely destroyed. She gets the house and enough money to be fine, but she doesn't get to pretend like none of this ever happened. Judith just nodded her head like she was seeing something new and said she had been doing this for 31 years, and I was handling this with more dignity than most people handle. A parking ticket. I told her I was an architect and I don't build things just to watch them fall apart. By day 9, it was Saturday, and Linda was starting to get real careless. Or maybe she was just getting too comfortable in the lie, which usually look the same until they don't. She had started sneaking out to the back porch to take phone calls for 10 minutes at a time with the door shut, and her voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't have to listen at the door to know what was going on, because the pattern was telling the whole story. That night during dinner, she asked if it would be okay if Brandon and Maya came over next Saturday. I looked up from my plate and told her that sounded like a great idea. She tried to read my face for a second, but she didn't find anything because I wasn't leaving any clues behind. She asked if I was sure since she knew I wasn't exactly Brandon's biggest fan, but I just gave her a warm, easy smile. The kind of smile a man has when he has got a perfect set of plans. I told her it was totally fine and to go ahead and invite them over. I knew exactly what was coming, even if I hadn't told her yet, and she just smiled back, looking relieved. She had mistaken my patience for being oblivious, and that was going to be the last big mistake of her marriage now. If you have been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe, because only a small fraction of people ever do, but it is what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. By day 12 on Tuesday, I made a call that completely redesigned the layout of my entire world, and it wasn't to my wife or to that guy Brandon, and it wasn't even my lawyer Judith on the other end of the line. Either the person I dialed was Maya Pierce, and before you go judging me for that, you have to understand something important, because Maya was the only person in this whole mess who hadn't done a single thing wrong while everyone else was busy making one awful decision after another. Maya had stayed completely in the dark. She was a sharp woman with a good sense of humor, and for the last 12 days she had no reason to doubt her husband's lies about where he was or what he was up to. She had every right to know the truth. Maybe not from me personally, and certainly not right away, but the facts needed to find her eventually. Once the evidence was rock solid, I knew she deserved to see it for herself. so I put a very specific plan into motion. It was a careful and deliberate arrangement, the kind that required a forensic accountant named Victor Lang, who had worked with my partner Marcus in the past, and we put together a manila folder and an envelope addressed to Maya's sister, who lives over in Draper. That package was set for delivery on day 17, and not a single second earlier than that, because sometimes you have to get the timing just right if you want the whole structure to come down correctly by day 13. It was Wednesday, and I stayed late at the office trying to keep my head down and work on my projects. When I finally walked into the house, Linda was already out cold and her phone was sitting face down on her bedside table with the screen, brightness turned way down. It was the kind of low-light setting you only use when you are trying to hide something. And I just stood there in the frame of our bedroom door for a minute. This was the bedroom of the house I had put my heart into. Designing in a canyon. I picked out myself where every window was positioned to bring the mountains right inside with us as I watched my wife sleep. I felt this heavy and specific kind of sadness that hits an architect when he finishes looking over the plans and realizes the whole building is beyond saving and has to be leveled. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just grieving, because there is a massive difference between those two things when you are angry. You just want to smash everything in sight. But when you are grieving, you are looking at the rubble and wondering what you can possibly build in its place. I walked out to the kitchen and brewed a cup of tea that I never even touched while sitting at the dining table I had crafted by hand using a reclaimed oak beam from an old farmhouse out in Toole County. I just sat there and started to draw. But I wasn't working on any professional blueprints. Just simple lines on a page. It was the same thing I used to do back when I was 23 years old and wide awake at night, because sketching out shapes was the only way I knew how to make the world make sense again. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, I had something on that paper that wasn't exactly a blueprint, but it wasn't just an emotion. Either it was a firm decision, and day 17 was only 4 days down the road. You can learn everything you need to know about a person by watching how they walk into a room where they think they are totally safe on day 17, which was a surprisingly warm Sunday for October. Linda walked through the front door of our home in Emigration Canyon. The Wasatch Mountains were glowing in shades of gold and amber, like they had put on their best clothes for the occasion, and she had a big smile on her face. She was still chuckling over some joke Maya had made in the car, which was just the tail end of an inside story I wasn't part of and didn't really care to be. She was holding a bottle of wine for our dinner, and she had this easy lightness about her that only comes from someone who thinks they are walking into just another normal night. She only made it about 3 steps into the house before she froze. The entire house was packed up, and it wasn't like someone had broken in or trashed the place. It was all systematically packed away. Everything she owned, from her clothes and books to that record collection she spent 9 years building, was in boxes, along with the photos she picked out. And the pillows I never really liked, even that unopened bottle of hot sauce from Mexico, was boxed up and labeled and stacked with the kind of perfect precision you only get from a man who measures things for a living. I'd counted exactly 16 boxes, and every single one of them had clear block letters on the side telling her exactly which room they came from. It was a complete filing system. For a life I was handing back to her. She almost dropped that wine bottle but managed to catch it just in time, and she said my name in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it. I just said, "Hey, Linda." I was sitting right there at the kitchen table with my jacket on, and my hands resting flat against the wood that was the table I had built myself out of solid oak, where we had sat for 10 years of meals together. I told her to close the door because there was a chill in the air, and she shut the door real slow, like she was trying to buy herself a few extra seconds to think. Her eyes went from the stacks of boxes to me, and then right back to the boxes, and she stopped and asked me what in the world was going on. I told her I was just giving her some help with moving, and that I made sure to label everything so she knew what was from the kitchen or the bedroom or the office. I told her the boxes out in the hall were just some random things I found, and since I wasn't always positive which things belonged to both of us and which were just hers, I decided to let her take it all. She could take her time going through it all later on. She tried to say my full name, but her voice broke right in the middle of it, and she asked me what I thought I was doing. I told her I was just being organized like I always am. She used to complain about how I was too orderly, but it turns out that trait comes in pretty handy during a breakup. She walked across the kitchen in a few quick steps to set the wine on the counter, and when she stood in front of me, I saw it. It wasn't guilt on her face. Not yet, anyway. It was something a lot more complex than that. She looked like a woman who was desperately trying to make sense of a situation she had completely misread. She begged me to just talk to her and told me she would listen to whatever was on my mind. But I kept my voice gentle and told her to take a seat. She sat down opposite me with her hands folded in her lap, and I reached into a folder I had ready and laid 3 specific items out on the table right between us. The first thing I showed her was a photo of that pregnancy test printed out on a regular sheet of paper, and it was cold and clear and left no room for questions when she saw it. Her face went through a change that I am not going to describe, because even when a marriage is falling apart, some things should stay private. The second item was a legal document straight from Judith Harper's office, which was a petition for divorce that I had already filed. I had it taken care of at 8 in the morning this past Friday. She looked down at the paperwork and then stared right back at me. So I showed her the third thing, which was a printout of an email. It was 3 paragraphs long and had been sent using the resort Wi-Fi down in Cabo. On the 6th day of her vacation, it went from Linda's private account to a Gmail address that a guy Marcus knows was able to trace back to Brandon Pierce after some real patient detective work. I had read the whole thing twice, and I definitely didn't need to look at it a third time, because there are some measurements you only have to take one time to know the truth. The kitchen went completely silent and out in the canyon. You could hear the wind blowing through the branches of the oak trees, and it sounded just like someone taking a deep breath. She asked me in a whisper how long I had known, and I told her I found out on Sunday the 8th. I found the proof in the bathroom trash while I was taking care of the laundry, and I took a beat and reminded her that I have always been the one to handle the laundry. She just shut her eyes tight and started to say she was sorry, but I told her that wasn't the point. I reached out and squared up the papers on the table out of habit because it was just the reflex of a man who likes to keep things in order. Even when everything is crashing down around him, the thing is an apology, and the consequences of your actions are 2 completely different things. And I think deep down she always knew I felt that way. She looked at me like she was standing in the ruins of a building trying to find the exit and asked where she was supposed to go. Now I told her she should go to Maya's, and I watched the realization sink in slowly as the color left her face. She whispered, asking what I had done, and I told her I hadn't done a thing yet because I'm an architect and I don't move until I know exactly which walls are holding up the roof. Right. Then my phone buzzed on the table and I flipped it over so she could see the text from my brother Troy saying that Maya had just called him, and she knew every single detail. Linda looked at that screen and asked in a tiny voice how she found out. So I told her it was through a contact who believed Maya deserved the chance to make her own choices separate from mine. I stood up and straightened my jacket the way a grown man is supposed to do, and she started to say something about how Brandon would react, but I just told her that Brandon was having a very interesting Sunday afternoon. I grabbed my keys off the counter and explained that the investment group Marcus and I run, the one Brandon had been chasing for 7 months with his fancy pitches and expensive dinners, had sent out a formal letter on Friday afternoon to withdraw from the deal entirely because of a conflict of interest, and I made sure a copy went to all his other investors as a courtesy, which is just standard procedure in our business. She just stood there, looking hollow, repeating those words back to me. So I told her that, in the world of venture capital, when the lead money walks away, everyone else gets nervous, and it is not personal. It is just the physics of the situation. I took a long look at the woman I had been married to for a decade, standing there in the kitchen of the home I built, surrounded by boxes of a life that was over. I told her I didn't do any of it to be mean, but because a man like Brandon, who tries to take my money while he is in Mexico with my wife, needs to understand exactly who he is dealing with. I picked up my bag that I had packed days ago and told her she could stay in the house until the legal stuff was finished and that Judith would be calling her soon. I told her she would be fine, but that the oak table I built was staying with me. and I walked to the door as the cold canyon air hit me. I turned back and asked her who had ever designed a better life for her than I had. I wasn't shouting, and I wasn't being dramatic. I was just stating the plain truth of a man who had built something real that she decided to tear apart without ever reading the blueprints. I didn't wait for her to answer. I just got in my truck and drove down the canyon toward Troy's place and sugar house with the mountains turning gold behind me. And I didn't look back, because I never look back once a project is finished. A few weeks later, Marcus told me Brandon had called the office 4 times, but we were always in a meeting, and then Maya filed for divorce using Judith as her lawyer. 2, eventually, Brandon's whole hotel project went up in smoke when his other partners found out he was cutting corners on his taxes, just like he did on his marriage, and I didn't have to lift a finger because some buildings just fall down on their own schedule. The next spring, I started drawing up plans for a new place in the Avenues neighborhood. It was smaller with a desk by the window and a kitchen that was all mine. I still have that photo of the test from that Sunday morning in October tucked in the back of my project binder, right behind the plans for my new house. I don't keep it to hurt myself or to feel like I won. I keep it as a measurement of the exact point where I stopped trying to fix a foundation that was broken and started drawing something that would actually work. Because every good structure starts with knowing exactly where the ground is. And if you made it to the end of this story, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button, because it costs you nothing and means the world to us. Thank you for listening.